think it's recording. Yeah. So hi, I'm Kate. I'm from South Cambridgeshire District Council. Obviously, we've invited Encompass Network to do 4 webinars for us. And first one, we've been really, really lucky, and Morgan has agreed to do a talk for us on LGBT rights in the UK. Morgan herself is a writer, an activist, historian, a bit of a performance artist, and an artist in general. There's nothing the woman can't do, clearly. Her work's been shown globally. Her writing, her essays, both fiction and non-fiction, have been shared worldwide as well. Writing for some well-known publications, including Dazed, BuzzFeed, and The Mail. So she's very well known. And today's talk is going to be on Molly House to Parliament. So I hope that was a sufficient introduction, Morgan, but feel free to, if there's anything I've missed off, please do let me know, and I will mute myself now. If you have any questions, just pop them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer anything.
Perfect, thank you, Kate. Hello, everyone. As that lovely introduction mentioned, I'm a writer, artist, and historian. I run the Trans History podcast, One from the Vaults, which brings you all of the dirt, gossip, and glamour from trans history. And I guess you could say that LGBT history is pretty much my favorite thing. I'm very excited about it. I spend all of my time thinking about it, and I'm going to share with you some really important moments from the past 2,000 years here in what is now the UK. It's important to note that obviously we have an hour and it's 2,000 years. So there's a lot of stuff that's going to get left out, but I have some good juicy bits that I want to share with you that I think will kind of illustrate the different cycles of understanding of LGBT life in this particular land, bearing in mind that obviously things happening in other parts of the world had a big influence on what happens in the UK. And we'll see that in 2 of the examples, one from the 19th century and one from the mid-20th century. But in general, I'm going to keep the scope really, really tight to the UK. So yeah, let's get started. Now, when most people think about LGBT history, what they think about are images like this of the early 1970s, when the gay liberation movement, as seen here at a Gay Liberation Front protest in the early 1970s in London, kind of represent, right? But actually, I want to take us back much further. So here in London, in the 19th century, someone was digging through the muddy banks of the Thames, which apparently is a big thing here. There's a word for it, and I can't remember what it is, but there's a whole culture of people who dig through the muddy banks of the Thames and try to find interesting things because it's been, you know, the port of the city for so long. And in about 1840, a man pulled out these 2 spectacular pieces, which are actually one item that dates from the 2nd to 3rd century during the Roman occupation of London. So when London was Londinium. And it might not be readily apparent what these were for, but these are actually castration clamps. When they're put together, they look a bit like, and please forgive me, a nutcracker. But these were castration clamps used by the Galai priests of Cybele, who was a goddess whose priesthood was made up entirely of people who were assigned male at birth, but then in their initiation were castrated and subsequently lived as women, wearing women's clothing and makeup and hairstyles, and made their living primarily by telling fortunes. The Romans found them incredibly garish and annoying, but had to keep their cult around because of a political alliance it represented with the Phrygians. And so even though the Romans made it illegal for any Roman citizen to join the Galli cult spread throughout the Roman Empire here to the UK, and actually not even just contained within London. We know that around the year 420, I think, there are the remains of a Galli priestess up all the way in North Yorkshire in Catterick in the Roman fort up there. So if you ever get a chance to go to the Roman fort, it is a minor tourist attraction. You will probably find more information about them there. These particular clamps exist within the collection of the British Museum. I'm not sure if they're always on display, but it is part of their collection. So a bit of fascinating history here. This also represents the first piece of recorded LGBT history in the British Isles. There's nothing that predates this so far. It is the closest we have to pretty much anything related to LGBT lives in the UK. But moving forward a little bit, in the 14th century, so we're looking at the 1300s, I always get confused with that and have to remind myself. But in the 14th century, we find the first written account in the English language of an LGBT person. So in central London, there were streets that were primarily used by sex workers and their clients. And at that time, sex work was not illegal. It was frowned upon, but it was also given a level of tolerance by the church authorities in particular, partially because the church was having some problems with monks and priests not being able to abide by their own vows of celibacy. So there was a huge culture of sex work, primarily from women who were working class and who didn't have a lot of other options at that time. And one of these women was known to frequent the streets, and she drew the attention of the local authorities, and they started asking questions about who this person was because she seemed a little unusual. Subsequently, they arrested her and discovered that she had been assigned male at birth. She was living under the name Eleanor Reichner, but her birth name was John Reichner. And she was then taken to the mayor of London. And what you see on the left here is the actual page from the London mayoral records in which the mayor interrogated her for probably an hour or two, trying to figure out if he should basically charge her for anything, or like, what was she doing? What's really interesting about this is that the record does not actually specify whether or not she was punished. And we have no idea what happened after that interrogation. There's no extant record to say that she was, pilloried or imprisoned for a period of time or even hanged. And of course, there weren't strict laws around LGBT lives at that time, but there were sort of the early start of laws around the idea of sodomy, and in particular related to the Inquisition. So it's likely that she did face some punishment, but we don't know at this time. But I think it's so interesting because it's so far back, and she's someone who is quite insistent that she identified as a woman, that she lived her life as a woman. And often for people in history, we don't get a lot of interiority from people because First of all, most people subsequent or before the 19th century were illiterate, so we rarely have their own accounts of their lives. And most of the accounts we do have are criminal records, which are generally only collecting the information needed to prosecute. So she's a very interesting character in a lot of levels. Moving a little bit forward, things really start to heat up in the 18th century. What you see on screen here is a person named Charles Hamilton. Henry Fielding, the humorist, and eventually the person who founds what becomes the Metropolitan Police, wrote a pamphlet detailing the life of Charles Hamilton, who was a young person in their early 20s, assigned female at birth, who as a teenager began living and dressing as a man and attempted to become a doctor. But at that time, becoming a doctor, first of all, was very expensive. So for working class people, or people like Charles Hamilton, who had to leave their families in order to live openly LGBT lives, this was a bit out of reach. So what Charles Hamilton did instead was to go study with two, what were called at the time, quack doctors. Now, we use that phrase all the time nowadays to refer to any doctor we don't like, or like COVID denialists or anti-maskers and all of that. But actually back then, quack doctory was its own school of medicine. It was mostly snake oil, let's be honest. It was primarily folk remedies of extremely dubious effectiveness. But it was actually the primary medical system in England, Wales, and Scotland at that time, because it was the only one that was affordable for the vast majority of working class people. And so Charles Hamilton studied to become a quack doctor, and then took up work in that profession, moving from town to town, selling these probably mostly fake remedies to people in need and hoping for the best. But what's really interesting is he also was a bit of a womanizer, and he ended up marrying, depending on the account. So the account you see here on the screen says he married 3 wives. Some accounts of probably less validity say that he married as many as 12 women. But either way, he was known to marry mostly young girls and widows. He did better with the widows. They had less of a problem, but everything kind of fell apart when he married a very young girl, and they set out together on their honeymoon and also to go work. And by the time they got a few towns away, the young girl was starting to ask herself some questions about, let's say, their marital relations. And she subsequently discovered that Charles Hamilton was using a prosthetic device made of rubber to have relations with her, let's say. She then ran back to her mother and reported Charles Hamilton for this deception. Charles Hamilton was then arrested, and as you can see from the image, was publicly whipped a number of times, and was also kept in a jail cell and subjected to the views of the public. So basically back then, which you really can't do now, but back then, if someone was in jail, they were a public spectacle. So people would travel from all around to come see and spit at and harass prisoners. And in particular, in the case of Charles Hamilton, prisoners who were especially salacious. So you can imagine how this went over. Charles Hamilton was then eventually released and was sort of demanded to wear women's clothing afterwards, but he was really defiant and he refused to go back to wearing women's clothing, which is very interesting. There are, of course, cases where, for example, lesbians wore men's clothing at different periods, but generally when challenged by courts or things like that, they would find a sort of middle ground, like Radcliffe Hall, for example, a sort of suit jacket and then a skirt pant. But in the case of Charles Hamilton, he was really, really insistent that he was a man and that he wanted to be understood as a man in the world. So he's a very, very interesting case here. But that's not the only thing that was going on in the 18th century. Indeed, the 18th century is where we see the explosion of an underground LGBT plus culture in the UK, in particular through what were called molly houses. So the molly houses were pubs, essentially, where from the outside, everything seemed like just your little regular local pub. But then on the inside were people who were cross-dressed, as you can see here on the right. This image actually is a satirical drawing of what people thought was happening inside the molly houses. They primarily catered to gay men and people that today we would probably understand as trans women. So most of the people who actually worked there were sex workers who were assigned male at birth, but lived their lives as women within the molly house. And not only was this a site of sex work, it was also a site of entertainment. So the first of what we would today call drag shows were happening back then. In fact, the most salacious thing that the London papers would write about them was that it was a sort of ritual theatrical performance to have one of the cross-gender people give birth on stage each night as part of their revelry before couples would pair off and go to rooms to, have relations. These molly houses were cracked down on by the government very, very hard. Many people were hanged just for being found in molly houses. And the most famous molly house is Mother Clapp's molly house. Mother Clapp, or Margaret Clapp, was an ostensibly straight woman, as far as we know, who ran a molly house and was very, very defensive of her clientele. In fact, when the police raided the establishment, they attempted to force her to give evidence against two of the men who were going to be hanged. Now, typically, the owners of these establishments would absolutely give the evidence to save their own neck, but Mother Clapp quite heroically refused to give evidence against them. And as a result, she was pilloried and then sentenced to imprisonment for up to 2 years. It's worth noting that we have no idea what happened to her after that. And indeed, people who were pilloried often died on the pillory. So there is a fairly strong possibility that she likely died. But she remains a figure of sort of a great protector of the LGBT people that she knew at that time. Along this time, we also have about a century later in the 19th century, in 1858, we find Eliza Scott. So Eliza Scott is a lot like Eleanor Reichner, who I spoke about before. Indeed, they worked on the same streets in central London, but many centuries apart. And Eliza Scott is different in some ways, though, because she was Black, and this is during the time of slavery. And she was quite known in the area. And again, While there were now laws against prostitution, they weren't widely enforced towards women who were sex workers. So Eliza Scott was making a living in that way, but she came under scrutiny and was subsequently arrested, where it was discovered that she was assigned male at birth. What's really interesting about her is she tells her story that actually she had ended up in the UK, having originally come from a slave plantation in the United States. She ran away from slavery and managed to get to Jamaica, where she made her living as a folk healer using traditional African folk medicine to heal mostly white plantation owners in Jamaica. Subsequently, she met a man who she fell in love with, who was a sailor, and he said she could become their kind of like ship's doctor. And if she became the ship doctor, he would take her to England, and then he would deal with his business, and he'd come there and meet her in England, and they could live a free life away from the horrors of American slavery. Unfortunately, he deposited her in London and then ran out on her, and she never saw him again, as far as we know. So she had to turn to sex work in order to survive at that time, because both as someone who was what we would today call a trans woman, and as someone who was Black at that time, there weren't a lot of employment options available for her. So she turned to sex work, and unfortunately she got arrested. She did eventually get out of jail, but we don't know at this point what later become of her. She had some designs on returning either to the Americas or to Africa, but it's unclear if she ever achieved those goals. Moving into the 20th century, this is where we see the strongest clampdown on LGBT rights that the UK has ever seen. And unfortunately, as we're going to talk about later, it hasn't actually ever stopped, despite the media narrative you might be hearing. So we're going to start with something called the Wolfenden Report in 1957. Basically, following World War II, there was a gay panic. In the United States, this was called the Lavender Panic. And here in the UK, it's associated with something called the Wolfenden Report. So basically, men were being arrested for homosexuality following World War II. Over 1,000 men were imprisoned for the offense, including the very high-profile trial of Alan Turing, which was led by Sir John Wolfenden. There was a committee pulled together by Wolfenden, rather. Now, interestingly, what we didn't know at the time is that Wolfenden's son, Jeremy, was gay. Wolfenden went on to meet with the 13 men and women of the committee for 60 days, and their report recommended that homosexual acts between consenting adults in private should be decriminalized. However, this came out in 1957, and the government didn't do a whole lot. So during the period from the trial of Alan Turing until the late 1960s, we see a huge police crackdown, primarily on gay men, but also in some respects on lesbians, but to a much, much lesser extent. It would take 10 years before the Sexual Offenses Act of 1967 partially decriminalized homosexual acts. I have to say partially here because in the media, it's often called the decriminalization of homosexuality, and this is not the case. It actually only decriminalized acts in private places, leaving many gay men to continue to be arrested for decades for cruising, cottaging, or simply appearing homosexual in public. It also established a higher age of consent for same-sex relations than for heterosexual sex, one that took many decades to finally repeal and met a lot of opposition. In particular, this caused a lot of problems for young gay and bisexual men who, if they were only 1 year or 2 years older than their lover might end up getting charged. So it was a huge issue at that time. Now, after 1967, something you might have heard about happened in America that was a little bit of a big deal. It's called the Stonewall Riots. It was not the first, nor was it the last LGBT riot. Indeed, many of the people who were actually at Stonewall don't call it a riot, they call it a rebellion. But on a hot June night in 1969, police attempted to raid the Stonewall Inn in New York City. And the drag queens, gay men, lesbians, trans people, etc., who were all there, and drag kings indeed, like Stormy Delavier, ended up fighting back. You will hear a lot of people say nowadays that they threw bricks. This is not true. There are no bricks at Stonewall. Indeed, the original reports said that drag queens threw makeup, pennies, and beer bottles at the police. They ended up locking the police inside the Stonewall Tavern, lighting their cars on fire, and rioting for several days. As a result, this was a kind of watershed moment for LGBT rights. Subsequent to that, people in the UK were paying attention and started to ask themselves, how can we be part of this movement? How can we end the repression? Like, the homosexuality had been partially decriminalized a few years before in 1967, as we just talked about, but people were still facing massive barriers to employment, were still being kicked out by their families. There was a huge amount of violence directed towards people perceived to be LGBT, as well as LGBT spaces, with quite a number of fire bombings of gay taverns and gay adult bookstores. So in 1970, just a few months after the Stonewall riots, Bob Mellers and Aubrey Walter met at a GLF protest outside the Women's House of Detention in New York City. The two of them were actually from London, and as a result, struck up a friendship while they were there. They subsequently went on to meet with members of the Black Panther Party and then returned to London to form their own cell of Gay Liberation Front. Gay Liberation Front London spread across the UK using direct actions called ZAPs to publicly fight against homophobia. It's really, really cool because not only did this group exist, they also had subgroups. So there was a subgroup for lesbians, as well as a subgroup led by Rachel Pollack, now the world's foremost authority on tarot cards, for transvestites, transsexuals, and drag queens. I recently unearthed the 1972 manifesto of Gay Liberation Front London's transvestite, transsexual, and drag queen group. And I was really blown away. It made me honestly want to cry. It was so moving to me because the things they were talking about then are still very alive for trans people. And I'm lucky to say that I have had the opportunity a couple of times to meet Rachel Pollack, who's still alive today, as well as another member of the GLF London's trans group, Roz Caveney, who is still around today and a good friend of mine. I was actually just talking to her on the phone 2 nights ago. And she's now a writer and cultural critic. Other prominent members of GLF London more broadly, though, included people you might have heard of, like Peter Tatchell and Lisa Power. Now, one of the most important things GLF London did was organize the first Gay Day. So this is like the first gay pride in the UK. And though they disbanded in 1974 through a lot of infighting, many organizations sprang up out of Gay Liberation Front London. So the Lesbian and Gay Switchboard, which is still around today, is just Switchboard. Gay News, which is now Pink News, and Gay's the Word Bookshop, which I highly, 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 highly recommend you purchase books from instead of buying them from Amazon. Gay's the Word is so spectacular. I love them so much. So, and what's really interesting is Gay's the Word has been in the same space since at least the 1980s. And that to me just sends me back in time in the best way possible. So this group, even though it only existed for about 4 years, had a massive impact on LGBT rights in the UK and fomented a very public LGBT presence here. However, by the 1980s, things started to take a turn. Just as LGBT people were reaching an unheard of level of social acceptance by the end of the 70s, as well as an anti-LGBT backlash, primarily from America, how to put this, 42 gay men in New York City were diagnosed with a mysterious and unknown cancer in 1981, I believe. It became publicly known in 1982. And by 1984, people across the LGBT world, primarily gay men and trans women, were dying in untold numbers. What we now know to be the HIV virus, so the human immunodeficiency virus, which leads to, in some cases, AIDS, spread across the world very, very rapidly and devastated the LGBT community. Interestingly, HIV actually appears to have been around for much of the 20th century, and there is some evidence that it might actually have existed in the 19th century, but it reached epidemic levels in the early 1980s. It affected gay men, trans women, injection drug users, and communities of color in particular. Mainstream society reacted not with care, but with a torrent of homophobia and virulent racism. If you've watched Russell T Davies' new show on the BBC, It's a Sin, that just came out, it chronicles this period. There's a lot left out. In particular, there's not a single lesbian in it, which is wild to me, but it can give you a sense if you aren't already familiar with what was going on. Some of the more outrageous things at that time was that there was a public debate over whether or not to tattoo HIV positive people or move them to concentration camps. Indeed, in Cuba, they did move HIV positive people to concentration camps, where many still are today. Global government inaction led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of gay men and trans women throughout the 1980s and 1990s. When I say government inaction, I want to be really clear here. The Reagan government in the United States did not mention the HIV epidemic until 7 years into the epidemic. So it's quite shocking. In 1987, New York-based writer Larry Kramer delivered a fiery speech that ignited ACT UP, the AIDS coalition to unleash power. ACT UP spread across the world, and Peter Tatchell founded the London branch, which still exists today. It is remembered as one of the largest and most effective protest movements in modern history. The work of ACT UP forced government action, got drugs into bodies, and saved millions of lives. HIV is now a manageable chronic condition for those with access to medical treatment. However, the fight to expand treatment access goes on. At the same time, the AIDS crisis set off a panic in the media over LGBT rights broadly. As this was going on, with tabloids publishing more and more horrific stories about primarily gay men, but also lesbians, a school in England was pulled into the tabloids when it was found that they were stocking on their shelves the first children's book in which a child has two gay parents, called Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin. This is actually a European book that was translated into English. It was only ever in one or two schools. Like, it was, no one had it, yet the media blew up this story that local governments and gay activists gone wild are turning children gay. And this led the government to the creation of what was originally Clause 28, but came to be known as Section 28, a piece of legislation banning public authorities from discussing homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. This effectively stopped teachers, doctors, nurses, and anyone working in a local authority from being able to speak about LGBT lives at all. Probably most of you, if you grew up in the UK, grew up under the shadow of Section 28, in which it was not okay for your teachers to ever discuss LGBT lives. In 1989, 14 gay and lesbian activists, including Lisa Power from Gay Liberation Front and Sir Ian McKellen, the actor, aka Gandalf, came together to form Stonewall to fight Section 28. Stonewall grew to become the largest LGBT charity in Europe and finally won the battle against Section 28 in 2003. So it took 15 years for this legislation to be removed. This fight is still ongoing today. Last year, the government was to roll out LGBT inclusive relationships and sex educations in school, and this was met with fiery opposition. And essentially, they were forced to remove all of the information about trans people from it, which is very messed up. Things didn't stop with the repeal of Section 28, obviously. So the next kind of moment in LGBT history is really about same-sex marriage. Now, while this might seem like a very new thing, I do want to point out that the first recorded same-sex marriage in the UK occurred in 1680 when English musician Arabella Hunt married James Howard, who was subsequently publicly outed as having been assigned female at birth under the name Amy Poulter. This marriage was annulled. This was the first of hundreds of such cases in the years to come. In the 1960s and 70s, marriage rights for trans people came under scrutiny because of a case called Corbett versus Corbett, in which the trans model April Ashley, who's still alive today, thank God, married an aristocrat named Arthur Corbett. Corbett's family was deeply unhappy about his marriage to a transsexual and basically forced him to take her to court and annul the marriage. The subsequent legal case effectively blocked trans people from any forms of legal marriage until the GRA of 2004. It also lost us the right to legally change our genders in the UK, which had been going on for at least 70 years at that point with very little fanfare. Decades later, while an entire generation was stricken by the AIDS epidemic, many LGBT people were shut out of their partners' medical care and estates by homophobic families. Again, I recommend watching It's a Sin on BBC, which is up on the iPlayer right now, because it'll give you a sense of what this actually means in direct terms. But like literally, they would not let you even see your lover on the hospital ward while they were dying. It was horrific. As a result, in the 90s, as more effective HIV medications became widely available, many gay and lesbian activists turned their attention to the cause of legal marriage. Same-sex marriage, however, only became law across the UK in 2014. We're one of the slowest countries to adopt it. Proud to say, as a Canadian, that Canada adopted same-sex marriage in I want to say 2003, but it might be 2005. Don't quote me on it. And indeed, New Zealand was the first, I believe, New Zealand or the Netherlands. So It was a really long and hard fight. And while not all LGBT people wanted to be married, and not all LGBT people even agreed with the fight for the right for marriage, I think it's important to note that this really came out of a reaction to the AIDS epidemic and to the sort of horrific treatment of the surviving partners of people who died during that era. So it's a really big moment. Moving on from there, once LGBT, once same-sex marriages were recognized increasingly throughout the Western world, a lot of people sort of hung up their hats and were like, well, we're done. We're just going to go chill out now. And unfortunately, anti-LGBT organizers in the US and the UK set their sights on the trans community as their next target in their anti-LGBT crusade that they had been waging since at least the late 1970s. Trans people went through kind of a big moment in the early 2010s, culminating in Time Magazine's transgender tipping point cover story, which is kind of the cover heard around the world because it marked a sort of watershed moment again for trans people's cultural recognition. After that, in 2016, the Women and Equalities Committee published a report damning the failures of the Gender Recognition Act of 2004. In particular, the current GRA from 2004 does not allow provisions for anyone under the age of 18 or for legal recognition of non-binary identities, and is such an expansive and unduly difficult process that few people in the UK have actually used it. The government launched a public consultation on proposed reforms to the GRA, but unwittingly lit the fuse on a massive culture war. Now, you've probably seen this if you have looked at any issue of the Sunday Times over the past 4 years. We are always front and center, which is very upsetting. I personally have been on the cover of the Sunday Times in a very inaccurate article, which is quite traumatic, I have to say. But essentially, newspapers and tabloids in the UK have spent the past 4 years running a constant stream of fear-mongering that are fear-mongering headlines that are nearly identical to the headlines from the era of Section 28. And I want to actually show you side by side what these look like. So apologies that the next few slides contain some distressing headlines. But these are headlines from the debate over Section 28. In particular, I want to raise your attention to the top right, where they say, protect your children, keep the clause. This was the main issue with Section 28, was that the proponents of Section 28 wanted to prevent children from turning gay by having access to gay literature or any positive depictions of gay people, similar to the anti-LGBT propaganda law in Russia currently. Now, if we look at trans headlines from today, we see the same focus on protect the children. So on the right here, we have a the Sun cover that says the skirt on the drag queen goes swish, 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 which is complaining about drag queen story hours at children's libraries. We also have a Times headline here that says calls to end transgender experiment on children. These are dog whistles for an anti-trans lobby that is trying to rescind trans rights. And unfortunately, the anti-trans lobby has been very effective. So in December, you might have seen there was a really terrible court decision made that has now blocked all medical treatment for trans teenagers and for other teenagers who are similarly questioning their identities. While many of us may have loads of feelings about whether or not trans teenagers should get one particular type of treatment or another. The court has now decided that even doctors can't make that decision. Indeed, families will have to take the NHS to court in order to obtain a court order to allow their children to go on puberty blockers or to use cross-sex hormones if they so decide. Now, when I say children, I want to be very clear. We are talking about people in their mid to late teens. We are not talking about 5-year-olds. There's no point in giving hormones to a 5-year-old. So it's very upsetting. And I personally find it very upsetting because I am a person who, though I hardly look a day over 18 now, I'm actually 34, and I transitioned when I was 14 in Canada. And so the thought of having that taken away from me and the irrevocable changes that my body would have gone through if I hadn't had access to it is extremely distressing. So that's kind of what's going on right now. But that's not the only issue. Indeed, LGBT rights are under a very sustained attack in the UK and globally at the moment. Globally speaking, there's still 78 countries where being LGBT in some form or another is illegal, 8 of which still have the death penalty. And here in the UK, there are continued debates over whether or not LGBT people should have full and equitable access to IVF treatments or to surrogacy for parenthood. As well, there are some stirrings that people want to reopen the debate on same-sex marriage. And what a lot of activists have been saying is that the attacks on trans people are really the first step in reopening all of the debates on LGBT rights. So we have to be particularly mindful of them at this time. However, that said, while we still experience an immense amount of discrimination in jobs, with 1 in 8 trans people being assaulted on the job by a client or colleague, as well as I believe it's 1 in 8 LGBT people of color reporting that they have been fired from a job for being openly LGBT. There is now a much greater level of acceptance in certain corners of the media and a lower level of familial homophobia. But these things still exist. People still get kicked out by their parents and disowned for being any type of LGBT, whether that's lesbian, gay, bi, trans, pansexual, etc. So I don't want to leave you on too sad of a note, but the world is not all roses for LGBT people at this point. And I think knowing the history of the struggle we have gone through, we can see that LGBT rights have never been a linear narrative from sort of the dark ages to the land of enlightenment where people are treated with respect. Indeed, we have won and lost rights over and over for thousands of years in this country, on this land. And so I hope you take this as a call to arms to be allies to people within the LGBT community, and to further educate yourself on the issues that LGBT people face. And if you'd like to do that, I will recommend 3 things to you to watch. The first is It's a Sin. As I've already been talking about, I have a lot of complicated feelings about that show. I think it does leave out a lot of important things, but I think it's really important for capturing a very intense moment in LGBT history here in the UK. I'd also recommend checking out the Netflix documentary Disclosure, which I happen to be one of the researchers from. And this is a history of the depiction of trans people in cinema and television. It's on Netflix. It's very good. It's very interesting. It goes all the way from the silent age to today. And I think it will really illuminate a lot of the issues that trans people deal with. And obviously the third thing, and this is just for fun, but as inspired by this photo we're all looking at right now, I'd really recommend you check out RuPaul's Drag Race UK, both because it's a lot of fun and because it brings together a very diverse group of LGBT people, primarily gay men and some non-binary people, from throughout the United Kingdom. And they talk a lot about the everyday experiences they have of being LGBT. So you can get your fun entertainment and also a little bit of education on top of it. So I'm going to leave it there, and maybe we'll have time for questions. I apologize if people have been putting questions in the chat. I can't see them while I'm doing this, so I'm just going to like have a little look-see now, and see if there's any. Oh yeah, I have been saying BBC, and as many people pointed out, the It's a Sin is on Channel 4. So yeah, if anyone wants to put any questions you have in the chat, I'd be happy to answer a couple of questions in our last few minutes here. But in general, thank you so much for coming. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you all today.
Thanks, Morgan. That was, I don't even think I have words. That was incredible. And my friend and I have been messaging just saying how amazing and insightful and how much we just didn't know that has actually, you know, there's a lot of focus on recent history, but to know that it goes back to sort of 1600s and sort of earlier centuries than that, that there's references to trans people and LGBT, it just shows that clearly we were far more ahead in the past than we are now. We seem to be going back in time. So thank you so much. If there are any questions, please do put them in the chat. And if anybody thinks of anything afterwards, I'm happy to share it with Encompass, and they can sort of forward it on to Morgan if they'd like to. So yeah, thank you. Oh, I think there's a couple of questions.
Oh, here's a great question from Paulina on the Molly houses. So what's really interesting is that there were more Molly houses in the 18th and 19th century than there are gay bars in the entire UK today. So there were dozens and dozens, maybe as many as 100 active Molly houses at a time. They were often very small, right? And very locally based. So different areas would have different type of Molly houses. They were not a cult. They were more entertainment and venues for people to meet up, have sex, possibly have relationships afterwards, and that sort of thing. And they sort of primarily catered towards a working and middle class group, whereas people who were a bit more aristocrats would have their own sort of refined circles to move through, you know what I mean? So yeah, they were a very, very interesting moment in history, and there's a lot of great books on the Molly houses you can look up. And Ellie asks around the trans fortune tellers from the first slide. So they are the Galli, so that's Galli. They have a great article on Wikipedia if you'd like to get more information about them. And they worship the goddess Cybele, so Cybele. And there's a lot of fascinating information. They're my favorite bit in history. And actually, they potentially stretch back as far as 2500 BCE, where in the Fertile Crescent, so what's today the Middle East, in ancient Sumer, the goddess Inanna was worshipped by a priesthood called the Gala, so very similar name, who similarly were assigned male at birth, but dressed and lived as women and actually spoke the women's tongue, because in ancient Sumer, women spoke a different language from men, which I think is like so wild. Can you imagine the gender relations of like women speak a totally different language than everybody else? Anyway, fascinating. Let's see, any more questions?
I've got a couple on the Q&A.
Okay.
Do you see any similarities on LGBT exclusion and attacks between centuries before and now?
Absolutely. I think what we have to remember is that it's a continuous line of attack, and that the anti-LGBT messaging has been developed over hundreds of years. And it has changed over time, but it's really kept a lot of its base foundation. So at heart, there is a big panic over like, what about the children? What if the children all become gay? And then society will fall apart and men will marry men and women will marry women and the sky will fall. And as we've seen, the sky does not fall when men marry men and women marry women. It really doesn't make much of a difference to most people's lives. But I think what's really interesting is that in the 19th century and into the 20th century, we begin to move away from religious arguments and into medical arguments. So the early psychologists, as well as various types of medical doctors, tried to ascribe different things that were wrong about LGBT lifestyles physically in the body. Most of this has been discounted as junk science, thank God. But we see that again today in the debate, quote unquote, debate over trans people's lives. So a lot of panic is happening right now, as we touched on earlier, around trans people's access to healthcare and whether or not trans people should have any rights. But they all have common threads, basically.
Brilliant, thank you. And finally, were molly houses spread right across the country, or were they mainly located in towns and cities?
Molly houses were primarily in cities. So the best documentation we have for them is in London. It's likely that there were probably molly houses in places like Manchester as well, and Edinburgh, for example, but it was very much a London-based phenomenon in particular, because it's only with the sort of anonymity of the city that people could go to a place like that without being noticed. So there was a lot about secrecy around it, because that's the only way you could stay safe, really. But yeah, the molly houses are such a fascinating moment. And there's even there's a film about them from the 90s, if you search it up, as well as a play called Mother Clap's Molly House that gets put on occasionally. So yeah, they're really fascinating.
Thank you. See, I'm learning everything today. Is there anywhere else we can hear more from you? Or have you got any other resources that we can sort of share with like staff and in sort of further afield, that so people can learn some more?
Absolutely. So I run a podcast on trans history, where I zero in on one person's particular story each month, over the past 150 years usually, so not as long back as this. It's called One from the Vaults, and it's available on Apple Podcasts as well as SoundCloud. And it's freely available, so just go and listen. I've been running it for about 5 years now, so there's loads of content, as well as quite a number of British specific content. If you check out the episode Valentine's Day Special, it tells the story of the UK's first transsexual man and his trans woman girlfriend, and the somewhat hilarious and somewhat tragic things that happened after they got outed in the press in the 1950s. He ends up going on to become a Buddhist monk, one of the very first Westerners to become a Tibetan Buddhist monk. And she ends up going on to become a race car driver. So anyway, it's wild, and it takes you all across the world. So go check it out. One from the Vaults. Just search it on Apple Podcasts on your phone if you have an iPhone, or look it up on SoundCloud.
Okay, awesome. I'll dig out for everyone at South Cams. I'll dig out and I'll share on our sort of EDI teams any links for any of these sources. If I can find them, I'll share them. Okay. I've already found the podcast, so I'll definitely share that. And we've got, I think Paulina's got her hand up. Oh, here we go. Could you comment on the Oscar Wilde trial? Did it strongly promote homophobia?
Absolutely. As I said at the beginning, I couldn't cover everything in 1 hour, but the Oscar Wilde trial had a massive effect on the way LGBT people were viewed in society. It was a huge media sensation, and obviously he was imprisoned for it, which is really horrible. And even though he lived subsequently, it did end up essentially ruining his life and ruining his name. It's only after he died that there was a reappraisal of his work, and we, ended up reading it in school and all of that. But at the time, it was a huge controversy, and is also what gives us the phrase "the love that dare not speak its name," which was actually written by his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, I think. And yeah, so the work around that is really huge. There's a great new anthology that just came out, which includes De Profundis, the piece that Oscar Wilde wrote from In the Goal. And the anthology is called Queer, by Frank Wynne. And it is LGBT writings from ancient times to yesterday. It's 700 pages long and includes both historical and contemporary LGBT writing, not just from the UK, but from around the world. So it includes people from Japan, people from India, it includes Moroccan writers. 30 different countries are represented, all translated into English. And it does include Oscar Wilde's De Profundis. So if you'd like to read a bit more, particularly of this historical examples, I'd recommend checking it out.
Okay, thank you. I think I've covered everybody's questions. In the chat, Chloe has shared in some more additional text to check out if anybody's interested. But I think that's everything. If anybody thinks of any more questions, just drop me a message or send me an email and I'll forward it on to Encompass and we'll do our best to get you an answer. But I think we've definitely got some further reading to do. And without a shadow of a doubt, everyone watch It's a Sin on Channel 4. It's just the talk of the town at the moment, so everybody should check it out. And it is our recommended watching this week. So, okay.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Take care.
Thanks. Take care, Morgan. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.